In the summer of 1947, a British lawyer named Cyril Radcliffe arrived in India for the first time in his life. He was given maps, outdated census data, 5 weeks, and the job of drawing a line through a subcontinent of 400 million people. He had never been to India. He was chosen partly for that reason. The thinking was that a man with no local knowledge could have no local loyalties. The line he drew is still there. It is still contested, and in the weeks after it was published, somewhere around 15 million people picked up what they could carry and walked in both directions in what remains the largest migration in human history. Estimates of how many died on the way run from several 100,000 to 2 million. Nobody knows because nobody was counting. The flaw was visible before he started, and it wasn't Radcliffe, it was the clock. The British had planned to leave India in June 1948. That was already ambitious for an operation of this size. Then the timetable was pulled forward to August 1947, cutting the better part of a year out of the schedule. There were reasons. Communal violence was rising, the administration was exhausted and financially spent after the war, and the calculation was that a fast exit was safer than a slow one. But the effect was to take the most consequential act of cartography in modern history and compress it into a summer. So Radcliffe's brief was impossible on its face. He had to divide 2 provinces, Punjab in the west, Bengal in the east, into Muslim majority and non-Muslim majority areas, using district-level religious data as the primary guide, while also taking into account other factors that were never properly defined. And the fundamental problem is that populations aren't sorted. There was no line that separated these communities because they lived in the same villages, farmed the same land, and had done for centuries. Every possible line cut through somebody. Then there was what the line had to cut through besides people. Punjab's agriculture ran on an irrigation system built as a single connected network. Canals whose headworks would end up in one country, watering fields in another. Railways, roads, telegraph lines, all engineered for a single administrative unit. Bengal's jute mills sat mostly on one side and the fields that grew the jute mostly on the other. Splitting the territory meant splitting infrastructure designed on the assumption that it would never be split. And here is the detail that turns the whole thing from tragedy into something closer to negligence. The boundary was finalized before independence, and its publication was deliberately withheld until after the celebrations. India and Pakistan became independent on the 14th and 15th of August. The map showing where the border actually ran was released on the 17th. So for 2 days, millions of people in the border districts genuinely did not know which country they were standing in. When the details came, the movement began. And it began as panic, in both directions at once, along the same roads. Columns of people walking one way, passing columns walking the other. Trains were attacked. Whole convoys were massacred. Communities that had lived alongside each other for generations turned on each other in weeks. And the violence was reciprocal and appalling on all sides. The princely states made it worse in a different way. Around 550 semi-autonomous states weren't covered by the partition of British India at all. Their rulers were left to choose which country to join, or in theory, to stay independent. Most went the obvious way. 3 didn't, and Kashmir is the one that never ended. A Hindu ruler governing a Muslim-majority state, hesitating, then acceding to India under armed pressure, producing a war within months, a ceasefire line, and a dispute that has generated further wars, a heavily militarized frontier, and 2 nuclear-armed neighbours who still don't agree where the border is. Radcliffe never drew that line. It's the one place he wasn't asked to. And the movement itself was not a single event that finished when the walking stopped. Cities on both sides were transformed in months. Delhi, Lahore and Karachi absorbed populations they had no housing for, and refugee camps that were meant to last weeks stayed for years. Whole neighborhoods emptied of one community and refilled with another, sometimes with the previous occupants' possessions still in the rooms. Both new governments had to invent, at speed, an entire legal apparatus for property abandoned by people who had fled, who now owned it, whether it could be claimed back, what compensation meant when the claimant was in another country that your country did not recognize as legitimate. Among the worst of it, and the least discussed for decades, was what happened to women. Tens of thousands were abducted during the migrations, and both states later ran official recovery programs to locate and return them. Programs that were themselves brutal in their own way, since some of the women had built lives in the intervening years and were moved again without much interest in their preference. It is one of the parts of the story that took 50 years to be written about honestly. Then there was the severing of an economy that had functioned as one unit. Factories lost their suppliers, farmers lost their markets, the jute industry ended up with mills in one country and the crop in the other, and both sides spent years trying to rebuild what the border had cut. None of that shows up in the casualty figures, and all of it shaped the following decades. As for the man himself, he destroyed his working papers before leaving, and he refused his fee. The sum involved was substantial, and he declined to take it. He never returned to the subcontinent, and by most accounts spoke about it very little for the rest of his life. It's hard to read that as anything but a man who understood exactly what had been asked of him and what it had produced. But focusing on Radcliffe is the comfortable mistake, and it's worth resisting because it makes this a story about one man's judgment. It wasn't. The failure was structural, and it had a specific shape. A decision of enormous consequence was handed to a single person with no relevant knowledge, no time, no authority to say the timetable was wrong, and no mechanism for anyone to stop the process once it started. Everyone involved could see the schedule was reckless. Nobody had both the standing and the incentive to halt it. The people who set the deadline would not be there when it landed. That's the lesson that generalizes, and it isn't about empire. It's about what happens when the person making a decision is insulated from its consequences, when the cost of being wrong is paid entirely by people who had no say. Radcliffe's line was going to hurt whoever it cut through, and Radcliffe was going home either way. 80 years on, the border is one of the most militarized on Earth, and every year both countries hold a ceremony at the main crossing where guards from each side perform an elaborate, high-kicking, deliberately theatrical drill at each other to enormous cheering crowds. It has become a tourist attraction. Two nations built a daily performance out of a line drawn in 5 weeks by a man who had never seen the country, which leaves the question worth carrying. How many lines are being drawn right now by people who will never have to live on either side of them?